the whole concept of nature as a distinct entity is uh, is cultural in the sense that, you can find in religions, this idea of separating humans from nature and separating humans from God or from the gods. And, I guess in, say, the Christian tradition, that, humans being given dominion over nature. And so there's this fundamentally taught concept that humans are separate from nature as opposed to being part of nature. And that leads to certain lines of thought. And perhaps the most useful thing that I could say is throughout this whole time that we have together here today in this podcast is to recognize that science is really an elaboration of thought, and that the thought comes first. And we only study the things that people think about. And the things that people don't think about never get studied. And so there's this funny word in English called the unthinkable. But much of the time, the solution to what is unknown, we in order to solve, these unknown solutions, we need to think the unthinkable. And Werner Heisenberg behind me, who's one of the pioneers of quantum physics, that was this challenge that they were faced with, a little over 100 years ago, was that the mathematics was requiring them to think the unthinkable, to think that it was uncertain, that the physical world was more about uncertainty than certainty. We're in a world where everybody was really very rooted in the concepts of certainty, the Industrial Revolution. It's about certainty, how many widgets can you produce per hour per factory, and how many can you fit on a boat, and how soon will it get from, Leeds to Stockholm, or, I don't know, Rio de Janeiro or someplace. And those sorts of things, this kind of very regulated clockwork mechanical sense of reality that had been at the core of Western thought and Western science for centuries, was being kind of challenged, because it's like, if you look at the inner workings of the clock, you actually have no idea what time it is. It's not until you stand all the way back and look at it from the outside that you can really comprehend this concept of time. But when you go deeper down, it loses meaning altogether. And so, as we were mentioning before we started, it's like, how many concepts are there that lose meaning once we take them out of the familiar context of culture, of particular terrain? Einstein supposedly had his first thoughts about relativity traveling on a trolley car, moving away from the clock tower in the center of Berlin or Munich or whatever city that he was in. And he's made him start thinking, so what would happen if he was a particle moving at the speed of light? How would that perhaps alter perception of time, space, and all those sorts of things? But ironically, at the time that he lived, there were no time zones. So he was able to think of the whole world as being in the same time zone. And so relativity was a very novel thought. But for us, relativity occurs all the time. We live in these parallel time frames. The time where you are, it's 8 hours different than me. And to really comprehend that, okay, outside where I am, the sun is shining, and it's a beautiful kind of almost spring day. But somewhere else, it's already dark, and it's completely different than where I am. And so that's part of diversity, environmental diversity, the biodiversity of different climates and different zones. And this all seems very obvious now because we have television and other forms of telecommunication, including travel, that allow us to visit places very different than our own easily. But people like Einstein, I doubt he ever made it to Thailand or the Amazon or Japan and places that I've been. And same thing with Darwin. He what was really the most amazing thing about what he did was he left home on a boat, going someplace he had no idea where he was going. And basically, he was the kind of person that liked to draw pictures and take a lot of notes. And so he turned that experience into a body of knowledge that then impacted society worldwide, one could say. And so those aspects of definitions and claims and what is time, and so if people don't ask those questions, when they start asking questions about cannabis or even the space of psychotropics, they're missing a lot of points, because the thought that the person asked the question with comes from a brain, if it's imagining that everything else is certain except the uncertainty of the psychotropic experience, that everything else is certain, those assumptions aren't really valid. But people make them, and they're supported by everybody else sitting around them. And it's the funniest thing, people always ask me about, oh, so you worked in the Amazon and you worked with shamans and ayahuasca, so you must have done ayahuasca like a lot of times, so what was that like, so tell me about it, what's a real ayahuasca experience like? And people want to hear facts, and I said, well, you cannot have a factual conversation about psychotropics. Doesn't even make any sense, and they're like, yeah, no, because I've done it, and and I would see like beings from another world, another dimension, and I traveled through wormholes. And I said, that's your imagination. No, it's real. And people get very offended when you say it's imagination, because this culture doesn't regard imagination the same way that people from the cultures who use these psychotropic medicines, these substances as medicines and as vision vines and all these things, that for them, that is this great experience. And in this culture, people are busy denying near-death experiences and the things that people see there, and everybody's trying to define it. Did you really see Jesus? And well, the Jesus you saw looked different than my Jesus. It's like, you're at that level of experience where diversity of perception is paramount. You shouldn't expect that everybody who looks up at the sky tonight is seeing the same constellations. We're not in the same place. And even two people standing side by side don't have the same view. And it's mostly that we see things the same way because we're trained to and we're taught to. And so when you kind of unwrap a lot of that training and teaching with a psychotropic experience, then people are able to see something different than what they would otherwise see.